So, what actually makes a country a country? You'd probably think, a government, a flag, stable borders, right? But what if I told you that there's a peaceful democracy out there that's been around for over 30 years and literally no other country on earth recognizes it? And at the same time, a fragile, much more dependent state is recognized by more than half the world. Yeah, it doesn't quite add up, and we're going to unpack that exact puzzle right now. Okay, so let's start with Somaliland. I mean, look, it's in a part of the world that's often known for instability, but since 1991, they've managed to build a peaceful democracy completely from the ground up. We're talking their own currency, their own army, they've held multiple free and fair elections. By pretty much every practical measure, it's an incredible success story. Okay, so with that track record, how many countries in the United Nations do you think officially recognize Somaliland as a sovereign state? Take a guess. The answer is zero. Not one. A big, fat zero. Now, let's flip the script and look at Kosovo for a second. This is a completely different story. It declared independence back in 2008, but its birth was, well, it was born out of a really brutal war and years of international administration. And even today, it's still facing some major governance challenges and really relies on a lot of outside support. And the number of UN member states that recognize Kosovo? 117. Yeah, over half the entire world. Okay, let that sink in for a moment. A stable, pretty self-sufficient democracy gets zero recognitions. A fragile state that's heavily dependent on international help gets 117. How is that even possible? This is the huge paradox we're diving into today. So, how do we even begin to make sense of this? Well, we've got a guide. We're going to be diving into the research of 𝗤𝗲𝗰𝗀𝗃𝗀 in his work called The Politics of Recognition. He literally set out to explain this exact thing, these wildly different outcomes for Somaliland and Kosovo. His research is what really helps us unpack this whole paradox and gives us the tools to see what's actually going on behind the scenes. So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the recognition paradox itself, then the two very different stories of these two states. After that, we'll see why the official rules aren't enough. Then we'll get into the messy politics of it all. And finally, we'll talk about why this whole thing matters. All right, Section 1, the recognition paradox. Let's really pin down what we're talking about here, the difference between de facto and de jure. Okay, to really get this, we need to know this key term, de facto state. It sounds complicated, but it's pretty simple. It just means a place that acts like a state in fact. It controls its territory, it governs its people, it has institutions, but it doesn't have de jure, or official, in law recognition from the rest of the world. And this is exactly the boat that both Somaliland and Kosovo found themselves in. Okay, moving on to Section 2. Let's dig into the history here, because these are two very, very different stories. Somaliland's path was, you could say, really organic. It was built from the inside out. A little-known fact, it was actually independent for 5 whole days back in 1960 after leaving British rule, before it voluntarily chose to unite with Italian Somalia. But after a terrible civil war, it redeclared that original independence in 1991. And ever since then, it has built its state entirely from the ground up, even holding 7 successful democratic elections. Pretty amazing. Kosovo's story, on the other hand, couldn't be more different. Its path to becoming a state wasn't driven from the inside, it was almost entirely driven by external forces. So after its autonomy was stripped away by Serbia, leading to a brutal war, NATO actually intervened militarily. That was followed by almost 10 years of the UN basically running the place. And only then, in 2008, did it declare independence, with the immediate and very powerful backing of the United States and other major Western powers. So, you see, the histories are night and day. But does that alone explain the huge difference in recognition? Well, to figure that out, we have to look at the so-called official rulebook for what a state is supposed to be. Okay, so for a long time now, since 1933 actually, international law has pointed to something called the Montevideo Convention to define a state. It lays out 4 basic criteria. You need 1, a defined territory, 2, a permanent population, 3, an effective government, and 4, the ability to have foreign relations with other countries. Seems like a pretty clear, straightforward checklist, right? Well, here's where it gets really interesting. When you actually take that checklist and apply it to our 2 cases, the paradox just gets deeper. Because guess what? Both Somaliland and Kosovo pretty much meet all the criteria. In fact, you could make a really strong case that Somaliland meets them better, with more clearly defined territory and a government that runs itself without massive international life support. So, if it's not the law, then what on earth is going on? Right. If the official rules don't explain it, what does? This brings us to the heart of the matter, to the messy, complicated, and often unfair world of raw politics that operates way beyond any legal textbook. There's this fantastic quote from the political scientist Stephen Krosner, who said that sovereignty is basically organized hypocrisy. And what he means by that is that countries all get together and publicly agree on a set of rules and principles, but when it comes down to it, they act based on their own power and self-interest. And that idea right there is the real key to unlocking this whole puzzle. So 𝗤𝗏𝗪 research says we need to stop looking at the law books and start looking through 3 different lenses. First, there's simple geopolitics. In other words, do you have powerful friends? Like, really powerful friends? Second, there's what he calls normativity. Basically, how good is your story? Is it a narrative that people can get behind, that wins hearts and minds? And finally, you've got institutional gatekeeping. Are you being blocked by the rules of your own neighborhood club, like the African Union or the European Union? Now, to tie all 3 of those lenses together, Aidan's research gives us this absolutely brilliant concept he calls recognition capital. The best way to think about it is like a political bank account for a new country. You can make deposits into this account with good governance and by having a strong legal case, sure. But the biggest deposits, the ones that really move the needle, come from having a powerful story and, most importantly, from having powerful friends. And when you put it all together in a table like this, the whole picture just snaps into focus. Look at Somaliland. It's flush with what you'd call performance capital. It governs really well. It's got high legal capital too. But it's almost bankrupt when it comes to political capital. It just doesn't have a major global power in its corner. Now look at Kosovo. It's the complete opposite. It's lower on performance, but it is incredibly wealthy in political capital, thanks to the West, and in normative capital, thanks to that really powerful story of needing a remedial secession to escape oppression. So what's the bottom line here? It's that doing all the hard work, building a functioning state, following the legal rule book, it's just not enough, not even close. In the real world of international relations, it turns out that having powerful friends and a story that they like is what really counts. All right, so let's zoom out. Why does any of this matter beyond just Somaliland and Kosovo? What's the bigger picture for the future of sovereignty? So let's just run through the key takeaways here. First, recognition isn't a legal checklist. It's a political game. Second, who you know, your geopolitical patrons, can completely override how well you actually govern. Third, we saw how Kosovo's powerful narrative of remedial secession was a huge asset. And finally, Somaliland is effectively locked out by the African Union's very rigid rule about not changing colonial-era borders. When you add it all up, you see a system that isn't just inconsistent. You could argue it's a system that actively rewards politics over actual progress. And that leaves us with one last, pretty unsettling question to think about. If international recognition isn't a reward for good governance, for building a peaceful, functional democracy from the ground up, then what is its true purpose in the 21st century? And what does the answer to that question really say about the rules of the world we all live in?